Welcome back to another episode of the Bourbon Lens. This is Jake along with Scott, and we're in the office, aka my basement. And we have a special guest, one of our friends that we have come to know over the Instagram community, who is now a Kentuckian, Brandon from the Daily Dram. Brandon, thanks for joining the Bourbon Lens podcast.
Yeah, what's up, boys? Good to be here and hang out and talk about one of my favorite things, but I'll leave that cliffhanger for y'all.
There could be many things. If you know Brandon, he has a lot of favorite things.
Couple tangents.
Yeah, it could be the Georgia Bulldogs. It could be UCLA track.
Dog Nation, baby.
It could be whiskey. He does like that. I mean, that is his, amaker. It could be food. He's a foodie.
Big foodie.
Yeah.
Go Bruins.
Are we going to go down that rabbit hole?
It is a good possibility we see each other, Cats versus Bruins in like the final, Sweet 16 maybe?
So, yeah, it's going to be a curb stomping, so no worries. Anywho, today, though, in the cliffhanger, we are going to be talking about Japanese whiskeys. One of the things that Brandon is known for is understanding whiskeys outside of the United States. And in fact, we'll get into your story in a little bit, but you actually became a bourbon drinker second. You were a whiskey drinker of the world first. But before we get into that, it's March Madness season. By the time this airs, we are going to be at the Final Four. So let's just go ahead. I know Scott sports.
Oh yeah, go team.
Yeah, but you have to have a pick. You probably filled out at least a bracket. Who's your national champion?
See, I don't even know. I did fill out a bracket, but I have no idea. I have not followed basketball at all this season. I think UK's got a good shot at it. Now, I don't really want them to win, but that's neither here nor there. I don't know. Gonzaga, I think it'd be kind of cool if they won. Correct me if I'm wrong, but they've never won.
They've not.
And they've become a powerhouse. They've been a powerhouse for a while, but I think this season they've really come out strong. So
They choked last year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they had it.
After the double overtime game, they came out and they were up big on Baylor, and then
just went flat.
it went bad.
Yeah.
Real quick.
So Scott's gonna go Gonzaga. Who you got?
Bruins, baby.
Oh gosh, Homer. So I filled out 5 brackets. I have one. I always pick Kentucky to win, no matter how terrible they are. Right? That's just me being a homer. In my heart of hearts, though, I'm kind of torn. I see Gonzaga, Arizona a lot in a lot of people's brackets. I think that would be an interesting. I'm going to throw a dark horse into this just because the way they're playing, and this pains me as a Kentucky fan. But Tennessee's got a really legit shot to make a run at this. They're playing some of the best basketball in the country. So we'll see. That's my dark horse. I have them winning a national championship in one of my brackets, but in 3 of my 5, I have Kentucky winning.
Well, I think this season, again, there's so many unknowns. There's been a lot of losses amongst top-ranked teams that generally wouldn't happen, and that's going to happen in this tournament too. So, hell, you could have a number 1 seed go out in the first round, and nobody would really think much about it because that's the way college basketball's gone this season.
Yeah, well, and odds are in Vegas, if there is a number 2 seed to go down in the first round, it is Jacksonville State over Auburn. 2 Alabama teams going at it.
Auburn, man. They got a squad.
They do. Auburn could definitely make a run. It's all interesting. I just wanted to start with that because I know Scott loves sports.
Go team.
And it's that time of year, and so I figured we'd get into a little bit of the madness. We've sunset our March Madness bourbon bracket. We might need to dust that off next year.
It was so much fun, but it was a lot of work.
It is a lot of work.
What do we have? 3 weeks of tasting whiskey?
Yeah.
Yeah, we could probably try to narrow that down to 2 weeks with our...
Maybe do some fan vote, get it down to what we need.
Yeah.
And then, do those blinds. Like when you do 4 rounds of Sweet 16 and you could put out like 1 week would be the Sweet 16. Then you do your Sweet 16 and Elite 8. Then you do your Final Four national champion.
So what's the date of the national championship game?
Yeah. So we got the first round while we're recording this. And then the second round will be the Sweet 16 Elite 8 will be the 25th, 26th. And then the Final Four in the national championship will be the 4th.
Whoa.
Perfect timing.
So now we're going to prove who was right and who was wrong.
Yeah. And watch us all be wrong.
Go Bruins.
Hey, they do have a former Kentucky football player. They had a former Kentucky basketball player, Johnny Uzang, shooting the J.
He had a good year last year, man.
Yeah.
Played a good tournament.
He just couldn't get off the bench at Kentucky, transferred.
That's about what it was. You know,
They're just too good. Kentucky basketball is just so good.
He just was like a flower. He just needed to go somewhere else to bloom.
Just needed to go blossom.
yeah. Well, I mean, like, here's my thing. Like any powerhouse, right? In sports, whether you talk about football, basketball, you see it in NASCAR. People jump, sponsorships all the time, and they go find where they can get a chance to be successful. Sometimes you just got to make a move to show what you can do, right? Because you could be the fifth man on a relay, right? You're the odd, like the sub in. You could be the secondary driver at a NASCAR at a company. And then, for basketball, football, whatever, you're the second string quarterback. Joe Burrow's a perfect example, right?
Yeah.
Leaves Ohio State, goes to LSU, balls out.
If you ain't first, you're last.
Hey, that's what Ricky Bobby said. And then his dad told him that was a lie.
Slingshot, engage.
There's a goddamn cougar in the car. I think that's an underrated line in that movie. But it did hit big on Reels not too long ago.
I don't think I caught that one.
Oh, yeah. So there would be a younger man in the driver's seat or in the passenger seat, and there would be his wife who would be older in the driver's seat.
Oh, and he looks over at his wife. And
There's a goddamn cougar in the car.
I think I know what you're talking about now.
Yeah.
Those modern social media things.
Got to stay hip with all the kids.
My kind of cougar.
But anywho, far right turn. They don't do that in NASCAR.
They only go left.
See, that's not even true anymore. There's so many road courses now.
Oh, well, typical.
Like they'll be coming into Circuit of Americas in Texas, which is a huge track. I think it's like 4 miles. And there's a lot of right turns in that one.
Yeah, that's why they only go 65 miles an hour when they're doing that.
Yeah, it could be Formula One and they're going 180 around a turn. Fucking crazy.
Yeah, that new season of Drive to Survive came out a couple days ago.
Yeah.
Man.
Catch up.
I can't stop.
I heard that's like a excellent show.
It's a great show. Like you feel like if you didn't like Formula One prior to it and you watch it, you can't help but be into Formula One.
Yeah. I didn't realize the big Formula One scene in the States, like it's rather large, mainly out West, it seems like.
Yeah. It's an interesting sport because it's hard to watch or it's hard to keep up with because Sunday mornings you have to get up at 6, 7, 8 a.m. and turn on the race, which is not something we typically do here for any sport.
I do that for soccer. Got to watch my sanctioned Chelsea Blues,
No.
See what happens with the whole Russia thing.
Oh, because he's selling, right?
You can't buy tickets to the events anymore at the stadium. Only season ticket holders can get into the stadium right now. And so if you go to a game, they're not by law allowed to sell any tickets right now or jerseys, merchandise, anything like that.
Because it goes to the owner.
Because it's all sanctioned. Their whole team is, yeah.
Wow.
So there's some interesting stuff going on.
Well, and just a weird connection to the NFL, but like there's 2 NFL owners that want to buy. There's one that wants to buy a La Liga team, and there's one that wants to buy Chelsea. The owner of the Jets wants to buy Chelsea, which it's so crazy because they think they're paying money for football players now. Wait till they play football players in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like Cristiano went for $1 billion almost when he got transferred last time.
That guy is just insane, man. He's a specimen.
He's a once in a lifetime specimen. He's like the LeBron like comp, but then you have like your finesse player because Messi's a once in a lifetime player as well.
Yep.
Like that's the crazy thing. Normally, like in basketball, there's once in a lifetime players every now and again.
Messi's like your Steph Curry.
Yeah.
Like he just is a totally different style of game, but they're so dominant in their own right, and they're just unstoppable.
Yeah. The more I watch soccer, the more or football, if you're, our European listeners, like the more I come to appreciate it. The one thing I can't stand, but they do it in the NBA, is just like you wet fart on somebody when you drive by them, like with the ball, and they fall, and that's a foul, and it just really irks my nerves.
Yeah, the flop is real in soccer too.
It's my only downfall, but they have it in basketball too, and that's rough. Anywho, we've now gotten cultured. We've talked about the sports world from a whole. Now we're going to get cultured on our whiskey. So typically we do drink bourbon, but we are recording this during St. Patrick's Week, right? That's what we've dubbed it versus St. Patrick's Day. We've had a whole thing around Irish whiskey, and now we're going to drink Japanese. So Brandon, without further ado, tell us a little bit about like how you got into just whiskey in general, but just more importantly, Japanese.
Yeah, I mean, I fell in love with whiskey like probably most of us, right? I moved to San Diego and celebratory thought to myself, with a buddy, we should get some whiskey and have a nice whiskey and celebrate the occasion. And just happened to be a Scotch whiskey and it was a blend. And we were like, wow, this is pretty good. Like, this is not just for like old dudes to drink, and kind of fell in the itch and started slowly, going in with the buddies. It was like, hey, throw in $20 to $40 each, 3 or 4 of us, and get a nice bottle and drink it over the course of a week or whatever. And kind of got the itch and started wondering to myself, like, what makes this different from everything else, right? And I'm kind of just inquisitive by nature for cooking or food or process. Or went down the rabbit hole, and fast forward about a year, I ended up in Japan for 3 weeks and backpacked through the country by myself, and it was awesome. Had one of the most insane experiences of my life. But when I went down to Kyoto, I subconsciously knew I was like, I really want to go to Yamazaki or Hakushu Distillery, but I didn't really know where they were geographically. I just knew they were in Japan, right? So I was like, I'll figure it out.
Just a short walk.
Yeah, I'm like, okay, it's got to be near Tokyo or something. Like, I have no idea, right? But I was literally backpacking, like, walking 8-10 miles a day with my bag on my back through Tokyo and Kyoto and Nagoya and like the 3 biggest cities. And the last week of the trip, I had some friends come in and they wanted to go to this place called Arashiyama, which is like a beautiful bamboo groves. It's totally serene and kind of, embodies what you would think of peaceful and zen in Japan. And so we were going out there and hopped on a train thinking, we're going to go, take this 2 stops and then get on this other train and then go to this bamboo grove. Well, the train just kept going. So it was kind of like an express train in New York where it just kept going, and you skipped all the stops.
There was no stations.
There was nothing, man. Good thing they had, whiskey and beers on the train, so we were kind of just chilling and whatever and kind of along for the ride, honestly. And I'm like talking to my buddies, and we're just chatting and looking, and we like look off in the foothills, and you're kind of cruising along the like foothills of this Japanese kind of like, little mountain range, and it's just pristine green and forest and lush and beautiful. And we're like looking out in this distance, and we're like, is that the Yamazaki distillery? So we literally just totally happenstance ended up at the Yamazaki distillery. Subconsciously, we knew we wanted to go there, but purely accidentally ended up at this distillery. So, went in, and it was, it's crazy. Like, you could get, I remember the tasting I had there was I had the Yamazaki and the Hakushu 18s, which are some of the best whiskeys in the world. And then I had the 25s of each of them and the Hibiki 30. And the whole flight was like $200, right? You could probably buy a glass of, Hakushu 25 in the US, if you can even find it. It's probably $300+ for a pour. So the whole flight was $200 US, and really got, lucky with that experience. But anyways, fast forward, I really fell in love with that distillery, and that was the first time that I really had a sense of place. And to me, what Japanese whiskey is really all about is it's really about the precision, attention to detail, the blending, all the components of it. It's very much cultural, of Japanese whiskey or of Japanese culture, and they distill the same way. Like it's very soft, it's elegant. There's no flavor that kind of overpowers everything. Everything is very composed and balanced, which is, a ethological kind of like ethos to Japanese culture. So I just kind of fell in love with it. I'm also half Japanese, so the blood inherently I felt drawn towards it. But it was just kind of just a fun rabbit hole to go down and experience, and that's what actually got me into collecting whiskey too. So I kind of fell into not only the interest of it, but then like that collecting side of it, which we all know how that goes.
Yeah. Yeah, and I guess when you started, it was probably a little bit more attainable, and now it's just gone outrageous.
Yeah, I got a buddy actually in San Diego, and I remember very vividly. I was looking for Yamazaki 18s and Hakushu 18s and Yoichi and Miyagikyo distilleries from Nika, and my buddy was like, "Oh man, bourbon's really hot right now. Like, I think I'm going to start collecting some bourbons." And I was like, "Nah, I'm into Japanese whiskey right now." Just kind of hindsight, I was like, probably missed out on a lot of great bourbons back then that I could have snagged up for a good price. But I developed a really cool Japanese whiskey collection, and I get to share it with guys like you. And I know Jake's had it, but you're going to get to enjoy some of it tonight. And I think you'll really enjoy it. It's a totally different style. And again, I think all whiskeys from around the world, there are so many exceptional ones from every category. You just have to kind of explore those categories and really understand them to have a better understanding of what the style is, what the intention of them is, and then how they end up as in the bottle and ultimately something you enjoy.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I'm excited to dive back into these. We had them a few weeks ago, and I had a whole Japanese dinner and whiskey with Brandon. Good cook, by the way. Pleasantly surprised.
Thanks.
Yeah.
What did we have?
We had your version of, you said it was Japanese like pot roast.
Oh yeah, we did Japanese curry.
Yeah.
Yep.
And it was good. It was, if you don't like curry, you may not like it, but like overall, like super good. And then the whiskeys balance out the food, which was awesome. So let's talk about it. We have a flight in front of us. We'll drink through some other things as we go through, but in front of us is the Mars distillery, right? And I'm not going to talk about anything about Mars because I have no freaking clue. So I'm going to turn it over to Brandon and tell us a little bit about the Mars distillery.
Yeah, so I'll give you a little history on Japanese whiskey, right? So Japanese whiskey is really kind of started from the godfather of Japanese whiskey, Masataka Taketsuru, and he actually started the Yamazaki distillery in 1923, I believe. And he started this distillery back in the 20s, and it wasn't popular back then. And so he, went over to Scotland, learned how to distill Scottish style whiskey, came back to Japan. They started the Yamazaki distillery, and he ran that for about 10 years and then moved on and started the Yoichi distillery up on the North Island of Hokkaido. And so that's the same exact latitude as Scotland, very similar coal-fired, pot stills, which they still do today. They do really light peating. And then, fast forward a few decades, you have the Hakushu distillery in the early 70s, also by Suntory. And then you have a couple of different distilleries from Mars. You have the Shinsho distillery, which is in the Nagano prefecture, I believe. So it's a higher altitude, about 2,500 or so feet above sea level. And then you have what they opened, a handful of years ago in the mid-teens, 2010s. They started the Tsuniki distillery, which is that first glass that we got to try a little bit. So it's closer to the southern part of Japanese islands. It's more humid. It's lower altitude. So they have different styles of flavors. So most of the Japanese blends that come from, say, a Mars or Suntory or the Nika houses, they usually are blends of a couple of their distilleries, and you have these very complex flavor profiles because they're totally different styles by design. And that's really kind of one of the roots of Japanese whiskey is it's all about blending. So when you take these, we have in front of us the Komagatake 2019 limited edition. So it's a couple of years old. It's a no age statement whiskey, but if I had to, guess, it's probably anywhere from 3 to 6 year old whiskeys inside of this, maybe a little bit older, but it's proofed at 48%. And to me, you get a lot of definitely ex-bourbon character. So you get a lot of banana, you get a lot of that honey, a little bit of that citrus, but you'll notice again, it's soft on the mouthfeel. It has a really nice kind of palate feel. The texture is good. It's very balanced, and it's definitely a change of pace from bourbon for sure.
Yeah, that's the one thing I've learned to appreciate about the Japanese style of whiskey. And Scott, I know you're just diving into it. I know we've had a few here and there, but there's more depth and complexity to it than just your heater. your 115, your 130 heater, right? Like there's an opportunity for you to feel the depth and complexity, a lot like wine, right? Where wine develops over time. It's not a huge ABV, but you get those depth and complexity, a lot of flavor notes. If you let this sit and you can let it like fall over your palate or hold it in your mouth for a second or two longer, you're going to get those flavors to show up. And I that's what I really like about this. Sometimes whiskey's just so damn hot. You just got to.
Yeah. And I think the lower proof point allows you to let it linger, you know, and it's not like, oh my gosh, I need to have a glass of water or something like that. It's, you enjoy the burn, what little burn there is at 90 proof or 100 proof. And then you taste the flavors, right? You get it up front, have a little bit of heat, and then what's lingering is what you're really tasting. So,
yeah, I thoroughly enjoy the komatakes a lot, or komaetake, right?
Komogatake.
Komagatake. I forgot a syllable in there. That's Kentucky in me,
that
baby.
that K one.
Yeah, komagatake.
Kentucky?
Yeah, Kentucky.
So I guess from a high level, is there like regionality is a big part of whiskey in America, in Scotland, Ireland? I don't know that there's a lot of regionality, but is that a big part of Japanese whiskey as well?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, terroir, right? The idea of terroir, of, you know, styles of distillation, right? And if you really go back in the distillation history of Japanese culture, right, they have been making sake for forever, right? And so the Mars Shinshu, actually, they were actually a sochu. They made different kinds of fermented rice spirits, right? And then they kind of evolved into the distillation of whiskey with more interest, just over decades of culture. And you have other kind of iconic names, Hanyu or Karuizawa. They're both shuttered Japanese distilleries, but if you can find a bottle of Hanyu or Karuizawa's, like you're talking in the thousands of dollars for any bottle, no matter which one it is, just because the quality and really the limited production of them. I mean, every Japanese distillery is very low production, so there's inherently a lot of supply and demand issues when it comes to that. But there's so many different components in the history of Japanese distillation that kind of, get the category to be where it is. And it really kind of went through a hot trend, a handful of years ago. It was very popular when Yamazaki won, World's Best Whiskey. If you watched Lost in Translation with Bill Murray plays this, right? And he gets paid to go over to Japan to kind of like make whiskey more popular, more trendy. So he's working with Suntory, and that was early on in Japanese, where they tried to make the Hibiki blend a little more popular and kind of bring some awareness to that, right? And then you have the evolution of Yamazaki Distillery kind of winning the awards. So it's been there's a lot of key points, I would say, along the history of Japanese whiskey. But ultimately it's all rooted in kind of the same thing of, blending and balance and kind of that harmony inside the glass.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that's really interesting is it's artisanal, right? There is a true craft to how they make whiskey from a blending perspective. I think that's the one thing that Japanese whiskey is known for, is that delicate balance of the blend, which is super interesting. And that's what I see, right? Is that true flavor profile in the blends that they get. So getting into these that we have in front of us, like, tell us a little bit about what makes these two pours special.
Yeah, so the one that we're drinking now is the 2019 limited edition. It's the second one that they put out. So there is a 2018, I believe. They're all, just unique expressions of house character from the Mars houses. And really, there's actually some really old whiskeys that come out of those houses too. But these are typically younger blends. And it was, try to create a more premium line, in my opinion, that would come out in the American markets or, wherever they're distributed, because they didn't really have a premium product in that category from Mars. With Suntory, you have the Hakushu and Yamazaki lines, and they're age stated, they're older whiskeys, they kind of have that premium feel. Whereas they've kind of gone backwards. So they released, what was called the Distiller's Edition, which were essentially no age statement versions of Hakushu and Yamazaki. Well, Komogatake and the Mars house, they're I think they started with younger whiskeys, putting them out, and now they're kind of showcasing, well, we want to have a premium line, a more elevated experience that's not like our 25, 30 plus year whiskeys, which they do have. They're really expensive, but they're exceptional spirits. They're totally unique in the style of what they are as well. And then, this one, the 2019 is predominantly all ex-bourbon. And then the 2020 US edition or limited edition is actually a blend of ex-bourbon and sherry. So it kind of showcases an entirely different style. It's also 100 proof, so it's a little bit higher. But just off the nose, when you smell that 2019, it's got that kind of creamy banana, American oak smells that you would get. A lot of these too.
Yeah.
Yep, and they're not going to use a lot of first fill barrels in Japanese style either, because they're not trying to overpower things, right? So they would rather layer in like some second and third fill barrels and then blend them back, so you have a softer, more complex spirit without overpowering the malt.
Mm.
Yeah, I just think, like, overall from a nose perspective, because I actually prefer the 19 to the 20 personally. The vanillins and the slight caramels in there are just so rich, but then you have that pot still type of flavor profile that's really predominant in there, like apples, and it's crisp and it's just super easy to drink from that perspective. So you add the typical bourbon notes, but then you add that like crispness of it, which I really like.
I feel like it's much lighter.
Yeah.
It's a lighter spirit. And then when you go into the 2020, which was the sherry, I get like a little bit of nuttiness out of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's much more like dried fruits, a little nutty, kind of has a little bit more of a viscous mouthfeel to it. But, I always try to, evaluate a whiskey based off of the style, right? So it's like, I don't want to compare these whiskeys to say like 100 proof bourbon, right? They're so different in every single capacity. But the one thing I do think is a fair comparison is like, you drink 100 proof of this and you drink 100 proof of like an 8-year bourbon, and they're almost entirely different worlds, right? Mm-hmm. Like just the feel of it, the mouthfeel. This is very soft. It's very has a like a velvety kind of lush mouthfeel to it. Whereas I find, again, with the sweeter corn, the bourbon, it's a little bit more intense, which is good too. I love that style as well. But again, being true to Japanese style and distillation, it's very elegant.
Yeah, I think what you would notice, right, is the viscosity on these are extremely creamy, right? Like it's just a flavor mouthfeel, like coatingness to it. Sometimes bourbon, let's just say 4 years old, like if you're taking apples to apples, maybe that's 100 proof. And we're just guessing at what may be in these. Like it's going to be a little thin. It's not going to be super viscous most of the time. And I think that's what's beautiful about this is I've yet to have really a Japanese whiskey that we've gone through, and been lucky enough to try quite a few at this point. That's been thin. Like they all have a nice creaminess or velvetiness, like that terminology, to it from a mouthfeel perspective that leaves you wanting a little bit more.
I think it's a distillate thing.
Yeah.
I think it's less about the barrel characteristics because, you would think that barrel char for a 4-year bourbon, big influence. But these, if they're aging for 4 years in more mild climates and second fill barrels or third fill barrels, it's got to be the distillate that's got that roundness.
Yeah.
And a bourbon can be sharp. And sometimes that's what you want though. But
yeah, have you smelled high wine lately?
Yeah, I think with a lot of the Japanese stuff too. Again, they're gonna ferment traditionally longer, right? They're going to probably take a little bit smaller cuts. They're going to use softer wood types, second fill, third fill is kind of refill barrels, maybe use toasted heads instead of a toasted barrel, just to kind of incorporate a little bit of that. But they always try not to overpower the grain and the malt in that, in the mouthfeel. And that's typically what I've noticed with every category. Some of the more intense, Japanese whiskeys I've had are, the higher proof, it's a distillery, west of Tokyo called Chichibu Distillery. So Ichiro-san, I think he's one of the best whiskey makers in the world. But his family has lineage of distillation as well. His dad actually was the Hanyu Distillery, which closed down, and basically the stocks got sold off. And he came back and said, well, I want to acquire some of these, but didn't have all the funds. And so bought up a bunch of barrels and released them all in what's called the card series. So if you ever look at the Chichibu releases, some of them will say Hanyu Distillery blended with, Chichibu, new make or younger spirits, or blends of older casks, and it'll be like, the Four of Hearts, or like the Ace of Spades, or, it's like the whole card series, like of a poker deck. And the higher the card, the more higher the price, and the more older the products, and traditionally more higher end they are as well. So really kind of cool, like an innovative marketing strategy, right? Like I'm in the marketing side, and when it comes to the whiskey world, and to me, I think that's a really creative way to try to create more awareness around the category. Again, it was not a popular category, right? And so, all these distilleries, they were producing a handful of barrels a day, and now the demand is so high that it's just impossible. So, a lot of these companies like Yamazaki, they're just playing catch up at this point. They probably are even 5 to 10 years behind right now on a lot of the products that they would like to release. One of the next whiskeys we'll taste, the Hakushu 12, it was actually discontinued for a long period of time, and I think they started to introduce it back, but it's just they've become harder and harder to find these whiskeys, and so it's a good thing I stocked up on them.
No, it's just so crazy because like we only think of sometimes whiskey having heritage in America. Like we're so short-sighted, right? Like there's been people distilling liquid for a lot longer than Americans have.
Yeah.
Like we're the newbies to this group of conversations. And so I think that's what makes it interesting when you expand your palate and your profile. Like you start to learn the history of what makes whiskey a world spirit, not just, bourbon being an American spirit. Okay, so we do have a third glass in this lineup before we get into the Hakushu. I believe we're staying with the Mars, and we had a little sample because you know some people in low places.
Yeah, shout out my girl Lily with High Road Spirits. Actually, met her last year at Aspen Food and Wine, and she's awesome. She dressed up as Guy Fieri with another one of her friends. They were both Guy, and I have the funniest picture of me with the guys. And funny enough, we actually ran into Guy Fieri at that place. Like I think it was that night or the next night too. It was pretty crazy. But he even had his Diners, Drive-In and Dives car outside.
Oh, nice. Sick.
Yeah. So really fun experience. But she sent us a couple fun samples. So the Tsuniki, the first, which is the first one we warmed up with, the Tsuniki. So you have the two Mars distilleries, the Shinshu, which is in Nagano Prefecture. So again, about 2,500 feet high, more at altitude, one of the higher distilleries in Japan. And then you have the Tsuniki, which is down south on the Kyushu Island. So it's much lower, a little bit more humidity, totally different climate. But the one we're drinking here is actually their Cosmo. So it's a wine cask finish. It's 43%, so it's a little bit lower from the other two. It's a blend of Pinot Noir and Cabernet. And these wine casks actually come from Japanese wines. It's not like a traditional American, Napa style Cabernet. It's definitely more of Japanese style wine. And, Japanese style wine, again, totally different style of product than say American wines. But, this is just something a little different. They have a really unique portfolio, I'd say, as far as what their offerings are. And this is going to be a total change up from the first two that we drank.
Yeah, I'm like raising my eyebrows. I was like, whoa.
Give me more. This
That
one
is-
like is like water, like that. It just drank. The mouthfeel was watery. Like it was just really fluid. I felt like I was getting, this is weird. Like you ever just taste something and you're like, you know what? It reminds me of my, like an experience, whatever. This like felt like I was floating on a river. Like that was the experience that I got from drinking this whiskey.
Like we were just talking about mouthfeel in the first two.
Yeah.
And now that we go to this one, I'm like, the mouthfeel on those two are nothing compared to this because it really just falls over your tongue.
I know. It's so like calming, and it just has like, it's weird to use those types of words like in describing whiskey, but like that's what it felt like. I was just kind of gently, calmly floating down the river.
Yeah, and to me, it's not the most complex spirit, but it has like this, again, it comes down to like that mouthfeel, the elegance to it, right? And it's 86 proof. So a lot of the Japanese whiskeys are going to be 86 proof, or, they're not traditionally high proof, big punchy kind of whiskeys, just by nature, again, of the ethos of Japanese culture, right? Like balance and synergy and being delicate and having finesse and feel. Like that's all very cultural. But another thing about it is, if you go to Japan in the summertime, right? If you're in Tokyo, Kyoto, you're in these, it feels like you're in Kentucky in the middle of the summer or in the tail end of it. Like it is so hot. It's so humid. You're just dripping sweat. I mean, it's crazy. So what, culturally is a lot of Japanese whiskey drinkers do, they drink highballs. So a lot of these whiskeys, if you try them as a highball, you're like, oh my goodness, like that is a total game changer. It's just, it's so hot and humid there. It's such a refreshing and light drink. And, the whiskeys, again, they're more delicate, but they just, as a highball, if you put some soda water in that and get it super chilled down in a highball glass with like a metal straw where it gets really chilled from the cool, ice and just the temperature, it's a game changer.
Save the turtles.
Now, do they do like slice of lemon or anything like that? Or is it just whiskey?
Yeah. Sometimes they'll do lemon slice. That's what I've seen more customary. I probably had a few dozen highballs when I was in Japan. But I just, it's not the most, it's not like, it's kind of like an old fashioned out here, right? Like in bourbon country, and you drink one of those out there and you're like, oh, this makes total sense to me. Right. It just fits.
Yeah. So one of the questions that I had, very similar to like, asking about the cocktails, is one of the things we talk about is barrel entry proof here a lot in the States, right? Like when we think about bourbon, like are they going in at the same type of barrel entry proof? Or are they kind of going in like at that lower barrel entry proof to overall get so they have to use less water ultimately? Or are they just going in like, 120 and they're just kind of letting it happen?
That's a great question, and I wish I could answer it more authoritatively, but I would imagine they go in lower proof, right, to kind of create that mouthfeel and that flavor profile with a little bit more, of a delicate nature, just as far as, Japanese whiskey production.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're not going to really see a lot of whiskeys in Japan that are, again, over, 100 proof would be a really highly proofed Japanese whiskey. I think we drank the Chichibu US edition 2020, and that one is like closer to 60, like 57, I want to say. Yeah. That's very high for a Japanese whiskey. And that's kind of what I was going to say is Ichiro at Chichibu, a lot of his stuff is single cask or blends of single cask, and he's a purist. Like he wants to put it out, at what it is, right? I mean, he only puts out like 12 to 13, 14 barrels a year in the entire United States. So I just got a really cool Chichibu this morning, actually. It just reminded me of that. It's like, only 42 barrels hit the U.S. I'm excited
rubbing his hands together. And
hopefully we'll get that here, and you guys will probably get the graces of enjoying that one. So, but yeah, I think, again, Japanese whiskey, it's just, there's so many different styles. You go with the Suntories and the Mars profiles. You got the Nika distilleries. Nika is predominantly Yoichi and Miyagikyo distilleries, where the Miyagikyo is a little bit lower latitude. It's just north of Tokyo, and it's traditionally a little more floral and fruity, kind of sherry centric. Whereas you go to North Island of Hokkaido, you have the Yoichi distillery, which is pretty much more ex-bourbon, little light peatiness that goes on with their production. But it's like 20 parts per million peat. It's very much a flavor ingredient, kind of a component in the blend, like you'll sort of get a taste of with Hakushu. And it's if you say you don't like peated whiskey, I will put a Hakushu glass or a Yoichi glass in front of you and say, try this and see what you think, because it will totally make you think about peat in an entirely different capacity. So
I guess one of the questions I have is, we talked about Mars and Suntory. Like in America, drawing like parallels, are we just talking about like corporate entities above multiple distilleries? Kind of like, it's hard to say, but Beam Suntory. Yeah. They've got Maker's Mark, but they've also got Jim Beam. Yep. So you would say like the Beam House and the Maker's Mark House would be how you would translate that to like a Japanese setup.
That's exactly how it is. So you have the House of Suntory, right? Obviously, most people have heard of Beam Suntory, right? The House of Suntory is made up of 3 large distilleries. So you have the 2 most famous ones, is obviously led by Yamazaki. You have the Hakushu distillery, and then you have what's called Chita distillery. So it's actually a grain distillery in Nagoya, which is the 3rd largest city in Japan. So huge city, basically on the coast between Tokyo and Kyoto. But that grain is blended with Hakushu and Yamazaki, and that's what makes up the Hibiki blend. Mm-hmm. And Hibiki is probably the most widely distributed Suntory product. I think most people would recognize that decanter. It's probably the largest distribution of any Japanese products put out by Suntory, at least stateside. And so you have the House of Suntory, and then you would go towards like the Mars distilleries. The Mars house holds Shinshu and Tsuniki as well. And you might recognize it as Hambo. So if you look on these labels right here, it'll say Mars Shinshu Distillery, Hambo Shuzo Co. So it's really the holding companies, and then they have the distilleries behind them.
Yeah. I mean, I guess we always just talk about it, but like Luxro MGP. I mean, you do have the benefit of having Indiana and a Kentucky distillery under one umbrella, but they're really not that far apart.
No.
Right. So there's not much regionality there.
Mm-hmm.
But you also got like Constellation Brands and that umbrella.
Yeah. And I think it's kind of a lost conversation when we talk about, terroir and American whiskey production. It's not really, it's not really a thing per se. But I think that, terroir can mean so many things. It doesn't have to mean that the soil's different from Bardstown to Frankfort, Kentucky, right? Between Buffalo Trace and, say, Heaven Hill. But, you go in to these facilities and you are enriched with so much tradition in the styles and these processes that have been passed down for ages and decades, and that to me also is part of terroir, right? It's culture, it's the use of corn, it's the water typically, it can be the barrels, the style of rickhouses that they use, like all of that is essentially a terroir because it's culturally what derives this style of production.
Yep.
If you go again to Japan, like they don't have massive rickhouses. They're not going to go more than like 3, 4, 5 high on a rick.
Yeah.
And they're going to be more dunnage style, like in Scotland, where they're on the soil, right, to try to create a moderate temperature to keep less of the evaporation and reduce angel share. So there's, again, it's the terroir and the water of the Japan, right? Like,
yeah, that's a great point. Cause like Dr. Rob Arnold, he wrote the book on terroir of whiskey. And I'm sure what he's talking about is the grain, the water, where things are grown. But even like so much about wheat versus rye in America, which is a big part of our discussions whenever we're talking about American whiskey.
Yeah. Well, and I think the other thing is like, it doesn't really get into a lot of varietal until you go into these craft distilleries like a Frey Ranch, a Westland, right? They're doing different things to get different grains. But a lot of times, American whiskey is such a commodity driven product, right? Corn is a commodity. Rye is a commodity. Like these are commodity grains. That's what the difficult thing is. Malt can be commodity, but a lot of these people are and distilleries are doing different things with the malt to get their nuances. 2-row versus 6-row versus malters brew versus whatever, right? How they're roasting it. And I think that's what's really interesting when you think about overall like components or terroir of the whiskey is they're doing different things. They're pushing the envelope, even though they're remaining true to tradition.
Yeah, like malted barley is not something that farmers just have laying around.
No.
Now they've got barley in the fields, but they've got to intentionally go and malt the barley.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can think of it as like, I think of a lot of the distillers up in the Pacific Northwest, right? They have such a deep brewing community up there that they actually use brewer's yeast. They cook the different styles. They use barley that are traditionally more for flavor grains in beer than it is in distillation, right? It's not a commodity grain. And so I think, again, that's what makes these different distilleries unique. That's what kind of draws me towards learning about them and wanting to know what styles, and again, what's making this, like what makes you guys different from every single person. And that's really, the first thing that I'll ever ask a distillery that I go visit or spend time with is like, what makes you guys you?
Yeah. And I think that's what's really interesting. And as we talk about the differences and the nuances of whiskey, well, glass 4, boys and gals, we got our first taste of peat.
Yeah. So this is the Suniki distillery again. So the most southern of the Mars distilleries. It's about 3 to 4 year old whiskeys blended. I believe it's 100 proof. Actually, it's 100 proof, and it's actually 20 and 50 parts per million. So, you can taste it and you can smell it, and the peat is very much there, but it's not like a traditional Islay whiskey from Scotland where it's so intense and so phenolic. It's really not very phenolic if you smell it, but you taste the earthiness. It kind of provides a little bit of umami, so to speak, and a little bit of that kind of earthy flavor profile.
Well, I didn't get it on the nose, but like I picked up on it when I took my first sip. On the nose, you get like forest, right? Like it's just that earthy, like outdoorsy smell. It's fresh, but like you can tell it's earthy. The first sip, the peat's there, but it's kind of like you just puffed a cigar. Like it's not like you just like ripped a cigar like I traditionally do. I think
it's like you had some barbecue, smoked meats or whatever, and you walk into a room where that was just served. Like it's there, but it's not like, oh my God, but it's there.
Yeah.
I mean, especially in this progression.
But what's really interesting is once you have your second drink, right, you start to pick up on there's the caramel, there's vanilla, there's those traditional like oaky notes that show up. And at the last part of it, like you get a freshness of the oak cask whatever it's finished in. Like that's the really nice influence at the very end is that. And we're in for a real treat with what was just poured.
Yeah. So I wanted to kind of segue, going from ex-bourbon to a little bit of sherry to a little bit of red wine. For me, whenever I'm doing a whiskey tasting, I always like to work left to right from lowest to most intense, right? Or from most mild to more complex. So the way that I kind of staged this one is, we warmed up. We had a couple of styles, Japanese whiskey, a couple different flavor profiles. Now we're going to work into the age statement whiskeys of Suntory. So we've got the Hakushu 12 here, which is quite possibly one of my favorite 12-year whiskeys. Really just an amazing whiskey across the board. We talked about highballs earlier. This makes one of the most insane highballs. It's got this perfect balance of ex-bourbon, very mild, vanilla, a little bit of citrus. It's creamy. And then you add a very soft amount of peat into it. And this is why I wanted to bring that peat from the Mars to kind of round out the tail end of that lineup, and then move into this, because you'll notice the peat, again, is not something that's going to slap you in the face. It's very composed. These whiskeys are very balanced. They have, true, I say, harmony in a glass, because there's so much balance and kind of intention with the way that they're crafted, blended, and created for consumption.
This one has more of that foresty smell to me, like almost like evergreen, like fresh cut, like trees almost.
So it's really funny you actually say that, because so the Hakushu distillery, they waited to make this distillery, right? This distillery was built in, I believe, 1974. And I just going completely off mental memory here. But they waited to make this, right? So you have the Yamazaki distillery, it's down, in this soft footlands, kind of very lush, but that one was done with pristine water, right? Because water is obviously a very crucial component in the distillation process. Well, they decided that they wanted to find the perfect place to build a distillery that embodied that kind of like evergreen nature kind of component. So if you go to this distillery, it's so beautiful, but it's basically nestled in these just forests off like about an hour west of Japan. It's so beautiful.
So I'm getting a little bit of the air from the
Yeah, exactly. You're getting the terroir.
Yeah, and I don't get the smoky peatiness on the nose on this one, like the last one.
I mean, it's there, right? Like, I think what is really interesting about this one, it's got layers to it, right? It's got the forest to it, and then it shows up with the clean distillate, the brightness in the distillate shows up, and then it finishes really, really just, I don't know, with a little bit of that peat, like a little bit of that smokiness, earthiness, it shows up at the end. But it's kind of like, earthy, bright, earthy.
Yeah, and to me, it's one of the first whiskeys. I kind of noticed this early with like a couple of Highland Park whiskeys, right? So my only exposure to peat at that time had been Lagavulin 16, Laphroaig 10, kind of your traditional Islay, namesakes. So I just assumed that, oh wow, peat is all iodine and phenolic and kind of has that, just very distinct flavor profile that kind of was, for someone who was just getting into whiskey, was, to be honest, it was kind of off-putting to me. Mm-hmm. And so I kind of had this bad taste in my mouth towards peat. Like I just assumed all peat is bad. And actually my palate has changed so much over the years that, I actually really enjoy peated whiskey like a Lagavulin and the Laphroaig. Like some of them are the most exceptional whiskeys. Bowmore's, when you get really old peat, the peat kind of settles down and becomes very complex and really nice. But this is what really kind of pushed me down that rabbit hole of thinking, okay, I need to explore this idea and this concept of peat a little bit more. And I got hooked on Highland Park early on in my journey, Highland Park 15, and it's got that Highland peat versus the Islay peat, so it's a little bit more vegetal, it's a little bit more earthy than it is medicinal and iodine. And to me, that's what this Hakushu really embodies. It's more vegetal, it's earthy, right? Like I think the Suniki peated that we drank right before this was a little more vegetal. This has a little bit more earthiness to it. So it's a little take on what peat can be. There's a distillery up north as well in Japan. It's called Akeshi Distillery, and they're actually doing peated whiskey. They're using peat native to the North Island of Hokkaido. So it's actually saline forward. It's got a totally different style to it. And, just again, another rendition of a peated expression.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's amazing how much influence peat can have on whiskey when it's really just their method of producing malted barley.
Yeah, they're using it, right? Traditionally, they used it to dry the barley because they had all this excess barley. The climates are really moist and wet in Scotland. And how do we preserve this barley so we can later distill it, right? And so they would peat it. And that's what they, they floor malted it, they peated it. Like they did all these different, practices culturally. And again, that's part of terroir to me, right? Like that's generations of distillation that's passed down from person to person. That is all embodied in culture and regionality, which would be terroir, in my opinion. these distilleries have been doing it styles, and they honor so much in the tradition of what it is. Just like we would see in America is like you go to the Buffalo Trace distillery, you go to the Beam facilities. Like there's a reason these are global iconic brands is because they're rooted in tradition. They have done this for so many years, and that's why people love their product. They make great products.
I'm gonna give a tasting note that I think is really interesting with this, like juicy fruits, like a juicy peach. Like it's just like it just is succulent.
Yep.
And like it's like you bite into like one of those. It's not apple, right? It's something that has some lusciousness behind it that gives you that juiciness. The more you drink on that, the more rich it is.
To me, it's lychee. It's
Lychee
that like
fruit?
juicy, but it's a very light and delicate flavor. Those the fruits you have to peel open with the little shell. Have you had those?
I know what you're talking about. I don't think I've ever had one though.
Oh man, if you have a fresh one, I'll get some so you guys can try them, but it has like this very, very delicate flavor to them. Like it's a very mild flavor, but it's so juicy in itself. So it kind of reminds me of this a lot, where it has that juicy quality that you're talking about, but it's not quite like a stone fruit, and it's not quite an orchard fruit. Like it's not an apple. It could be like a Japanese pear even, versus
It kind of reminds me of this Filipino fruit called dalandan, which is like a hybrid, like orange apple type deal thing. So you get a little orchard, a little citrus type thing. I was told I was crazy because I loved it over there. Like I absolutely loved it. And like everyone I know that's Filipino like hates it.
So you said juicy fruit, and I thought you were going to say like juicy fruit gum because it's all over the place, like with the fruit. And I think that's what we're talking about here. For me, there's a little lemon. But then also one of the first triggers for me was, and don't punch me, Brandon, but back in the day I would go like to a hookah bar and they would have like the flavored hookah, and it was like tutti frutti and like those mixed fruits. So it's just like a little bit of everything, but then you get that smokiness too.
Mm-hmm. Scott in his jean jacket and his bell-bottom jeans going into the hookah bar.
big hookah guy.
But it's not in like 10 years.
hookah.
But
He was 18, leaving his high school, just going to the hookah bar in the Highlands.
But seriously, it's like it's all over the place, and I think that's what we're kind of just talking about. Is like you're getting a little bit of pear, or you're getting a little bit of apple. You're
I think next week I'm actually going to San Francisco to judge San Francisco World Spirits Competition for the first time, and it's amazing. You sit in a room, with a lot of different people who are evaluating spirits, and it's completely blind. I mean, we're really sitting there with 20 plus glasses per session, right? And everyone will give a score. You kind of submit it, and then you kind of evaluate as a group, and then everyone will say like, oh, I really like this note or whatever, but it's relatively not open for discussion. It's really like, here, you submit what you think, and then it kind of gets evaluated from there. But you're with your buddies sometimes, you're like, hey, dude, I really like that note that I got in this. It was very fruity, or this peach or something, but you always hear something different, right? And it's like when we sit down, and again, to me, that's terroir. I was talking to a buddy earlier today, and we were talking about Chef Edward Lee, right? 610 Magnolia, local guy, super talented chef. And he used this theory of cooking with latitude. So you can use fruits or vegetables that come from the same latitude, but they can be from anywhere in the world. But when they grow on the same latitude, they typically work well with the same styles of flavors. And it's that was such an interesting concept to me and it comes down to like wherever you're exposed to, whether it's latitude or east and west coast or north and southern hemisphere, there are so many similarities that we utilize from culture, whether it's cooking or whiskey or, just style, whatever, it doesn't really matter. But you find these similarities, but we always resort back to what you experienced growing up, right? So I'm sure all of our grandmas used to cook some kind of dessert that will absolutely come out as some tasty note in some spirit or some whiskey or something along the way in some capacity, right? And it's like, oh, it smells like my grandma's pie that was back in that I used to eat back in like the 90s, It's like, it's so weird and you'll remember it. It's like so
Triggers
deep.
a memory. Yeah.
Have you listened to any of the Bourbon Lens podcasts? Because that's me literally every week.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, it triggers a memory, and it might be cherry cobbler to you, and it might be, baked apple pie to another person, but it's whatever those other elements are.
My thing about it is what's nice about whiskey is, and I think we need to do a better job of this as a whole in the community, is quit being so damn snobby about it. Like, I'm not standing on a podium here. Like, these drinks are for everyone. And you know what's nice about this? Like, about this conversation in general? It's literally a conversation. If these mics weren't on, we'd be doing the same bullshit.
Yep.
Like, we would be doing the exact same thing, asking the same questions, learning the same stories, because whiskey is about bringing people together. And it's about your grandmother's pie, or your, the thing you did with your parents that reminds you of X, Y, and Z. Like, it's those things what bring people together. And I think that's my thing about whiskey is it needs to be more tight and less divisive. This world's just so divisive in general. So that's my soapbox for the evening.
Inclusive, man.
Yeah,
That's the whole reason I got into whiskey in the first place. Is like, let me be a voice to remove the pretentious air that is whiskey, right? Like, I felt at the time it was like, oh man, there's so many like snooty Scotch drinkers out there that I can't even get into this,
Like Bill Murray.
I'm not naming names, but it's like, you got so many people out there that, and some people do it for a living and they make their living that way. And I fully support that. And I'm all for you getting your money and doing it that way. But like, at the end of the day, is like, I've cracked out some of these bottles before with people who are not traditional whiskey people. And they're like, I don't want you to waste that on me. I'm like, dude, I'm not wasting it on you. Like, you're going to enjoy this. That is the experience. I want you to enjoy this. Or I want to see just purely what your thoughts are as somebody who doesn't drink whiskey. You know what I mean?
Well, can I impress you with something about this that's, you were saying, I'm not going to like this at all. Well, there's got to be something in there that you're going to find that you're going to like.
Yeah.
Well, again, like, my rule at my house, if it's open, you can pour it.
And at my house, same thing. But like, and if it's not open, 8 out of 10 times you can still open it.
Yeah. I mean,
If I got to back up, then we'll talk.
there's like, my thing is I have 2 bottles on my bar that are like non-open. One's for my son. My other one's because I technically don't own it.
You still don't own that?
No, he won't let me.
Is that 2019 Stag?
The 2019 Stag.
Is it young Gerald?
Yeah, my dad, young Jay, won't let me buy. He wants to sell it to me for secondary now.
Oh shit! You've waited too long.
Well, so secondary originally was 400. Secondary on that now is 950.
Yeah, you waited too long.
Good thing I still have mine unopened.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. Like, my dad's holding me for ransom over here on a bottle I want to open because I love the 2019.
You just have to make the right trade at the right time, dude. But I that's what it's about too. It's like, we love so many styles, right? Like, I have a case of Yamazaki 18 because I know that it's just one of my favorite whiskeys, and you guys are gonna try that. Jake's had it, but for Scott, I think I'm really excited to see what you think, right? And that's what is all exciting for me. I feel like I don't know one whiskey collector or someone who loves whiskey that's like, dude, let me share like my favorite whiskey with you guys. You know what I mean? Like that is exciting to me.
Oh, 100%.
Because you'd like to see the reaction.
Yeah, like it's just like, I want to share something. Like, you guys are my boys, so like I want to share something that I hold in high regard, right?
Yeah.
And that's just what friends do. And really people who are not even like greatest of friends, they like be acquaintances. And I met so many amazing people in whiskey that are like, oh, you should try this like 15-year Willet. I'm like, dude, I just met you, but I'd love to. I appreciate that,
Oh, yeah. I mean, I've had that experience in a liquor barn parking lot. This guy was like, I'm out here just sampling whiskeys with my buddies. He's like, what are you doing here? I was like, oh, I just dropped in to see if they had anything, and I picked up like a High West or something, and they had a barrel pick of High West. He's like, oh, that's great. He goes, what's on your shirt? And I just happened to was wearing a podcast shirt, and he's like, oh, I know you all.
I told you to pay off.
Yeah. And he was like, we'll let's pour some stuff up. So the last thing he poured was like a Kentucky Gentleman, like, and you like scoff at that, but from like the mid 90s. Mm-hmm. And you're like, That's not the
Those are pretty
KG
good.
that
That's when whiskey was made a little bit different.
That's not the KG that I had when I was in college and threw up everywhere.
No, it's like the only time I've ever had Pappy Van Winkle. It was Pappy 15. I was sitting at a bar in DC at a conference or at the end of a conference. Another guy was sitting next to me. We were both eating. We talked about where we were from for a minute. He's like, "You're from Kentucky. You ever had Pappy?" And I was like, "No." And he's like, "Me either." He's like, "We're going to have some." So he just orders around.
At least you ordered the best one, the 15, man.
Yeah, and that's why I was kind of ruined for Pappy for a while. But yeah, he was a pediatric emergency room doctor. He was there for a conference. I was there for a totally different conference. Would have never just struck up a conversation.
Yeah.
And it's like, "Here, have some Pappy 15." We just shared a drink or whatever. But yeah, that doesn't happen with other.
No.
I don't know that happens in the wine world.
Was it a hookah conference?
Yeah, it was a official hookah conference of America
For lawyers.
Yeah,
Hookah Hoodlums of America. Nice.
yeah,
Yeah, only hoodlums smoke hookah. True. Facts. So we have this Yamazaki 18, and my Lord, is it good?
Is your mouth watering?
This one's good. Like there's just, you kind of almost feel bad putting tasting notes to it just because it's just a really good whiskey.
I'm like trying to move the microphone away from my face so I can get.
It's literally 86 proof, and it's so rich and complex, and has the most. It screams elegance to me, right? And to me, this is kind of like the epitome of Japanese culture and Japanese whiskey kind of collide, right? It has all the elegance and precision and balance that I think of with Japanese culture in a glass in a whiskey form.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, like I feel called out because I saw this thing. And I'm going to draw a blank on the Instagram account, but he's like, "You been to a whiskey tasting?" And he's like, "Yeah, I've been to a whiskey tasting. There's hints of stone fruit in there." And I'm like, damn, I've been called out. But like, that's true. Like there's like some apricot, like dried fruits are definitely in this, but it's just balanced from back to forward. Like there's something on each part of the palate that you get because it lingers with like vanillas and caramels and like that richness to it, like in the mouthfeel with like just a hint of that fruit, which is, I don't know. I just think it's a complex whiskey. And this is what I think about when I think of old style whiskeys. Like it just lingers on your palate forever. Like the flavor is just there.
Yeah, it's definitely very rich, but then there's that pop of fruit.
Yeah. Well, and somebody was talking about this the other day, and again, butchering this, like where I heard it. But they were talking about like old style whiskeys. It might've been when I was at Justin's House of Bourbon. Old style whiskeys, like just like sat on your palate. It wasn't a burn. It wasn't a hug. It was just like they sat on your palate. This has no Kentucky hug, air quotes. Like this is all palate, mouthfeel, texture, complexity. That's what I really like about this one.
Yeah, it really, again, we talked about Miyagikyo and Yoichi distilleries and the kind of style, the house style that they produce, right? This to me is Yamazaki Distillery house character, kind of in its essence. You have the 12-year-old. It's definitely a more sherried whiskey, but the Yamazaki Distillery and the 18 particularly, they introduce what's called Mizunara oak as well. There's a little bit of Mizunara oak that hits the U.S. as far as some of the more higher end released bourbons. The reason why is because the wood it's so soft and porous that they leak. So the casks, they have to be very carefully crafted. But they also, the flavor profile and I've done a couple of really cool deconstructed experiences with my buddy Johnny Mundell over the years. He's actually with the Maker's Mark now. But we did a tasting a long time ago, and we deconstructed the 12 and the 18 Mizunara when it came out. And it was amazing to really try the kind of the bourbon component, the sherried component, and then the Mizunara component kind of individually, right? And you taste the 12-year Mizunara component by itself, and it's good. It's interesting, right? But then you taste it when it's 18 years old, and it really starts to kind of develop itself. And it's such a unique incensey kind of sandalwood flavor profile. It's like a very delicate light wood versus kind of the traditional European sherry oak that you would get with a traditional sherried finished whiskey. So I think, again, it's so many flavors and different, components blended into this kind of expertise and elegance that is, again, very much Japanese.
It's interesting you say sandalwood, because like when I get Mizunara, I always think of like a cigar box, the cedar wood. It's like very fragrant wood, almost floral.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I just think at the end of the day, like when we think about these whiskeys, whether it's the wood type or the second fill or whatever, like if you're a bourbon drinker, which typically most of our listeners are, step out of your comfort zone and try some of these other whiskeys because they're really freaking good.
And I think it'll allow you to grow an appreciation for bourbon and American whiskey.
100%.
Because, bourbon drinkers, barley is literally, well, it does provide some flavor. It's included in our corn whiskey because it jumpstarts fermentation. They need it. Right? But then there's other countries that are just using all malted barley. So I think it allows you to grow an appreciation for those other grains or that style of blending.
Yeah, I totally understand. Like, if you have a preference towards a certain style, right? Like if you're like a bourbon drinker, you like bourbon, you like that, the intensity between like the sweetness from the corn and the oak and they, they really play well together, right? And again, Japanese whiskey is a totally kind of inverse experience when it comes to the traditional whiskey expressions. But then there's so many other amazing whiskeys out there. You've got Kavalan, they have their Solus series, which are all barrel strength whiskeys that come out of, typically anything from ex-bourbon to Vino Barriques to sherry, Amontillado, Finos, the kind of this dry to sweet spectrum. You've got Paul John whiskey coming out of India. They're southwest Goa, India, so it's very hot and very humid, kind of like Taiwan. So they get like 8+% angel share out of those barrels, but you have these insanely flavorful whiskeys that come out and they're like 5 years old. I mean, it's just totally different styles. And then again, you go to like Ireland and Scotland and you have, the traditionally 100% malted barley, or you have the pot still where it's, malted and unmalted barleys. And, a lot of that comes from, trials and tribulations over the course of their life cycles and the generations of, taxation on barley between the UK with Ireland, right?
Yeah.
That's why they started using unmalted barley. Or how about like this thing, that happened in the United States called Prohibition, right? Or the Civil War. Like prior to the Civil War, Canada was the largest producer of whiskey in North America. And there's so many different historical touch points, I think, that make it interesting. Learn about, try to take the deep dive and try to like learn about the culture and the style and what it is. And I think inherently we naturally become more ingrained in the understanding and the craft that goes into each whiskeys. And I've seen it firsthand the last year being in Kentucky and working for a bourbon brand, right? And being at Bardstown Bourbon Company, it's I see so much of that tradition, with people that we have on our team, and it's a cultural thing. I mean, you can't do it without these people that have been doing it for so long, and you have to pay respect for that and understand, that it's not just a job; it's really a livelihood. And I think that kind of reigns true with a lot of of the distilling worlds. It's a craft that's been passed down from families and generations, and it's truly something for me that really connects me to the spirit more than just being a bottle of whiskey, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just looking to make some extra money on secondary. That's why I like bourbon. No, that's what gets lost in a lot of this is, it's not about how much you paid for the bottle or what the status symbol is, but the story behind it.
1,000%.
Yeah.
With every pour, with every conversation, there's a story, right? If you're willing to listen. And we got a history lesson today. Like that was our story. And so, thanks Brandon for joining. Where can people find out more about, just Brandon and your whiskey journey that you're personally on?
Yeah. Give me a follow on Instagram at the Daily Dram. Love to talk whiskeys. And if you make your way out to Kentucky, please reach out and I'll make sure you have a good time out here on the Bourbon Trail.
Yeah. And, this is a little tease. Brandon will be joining more episodes of the Bourbon Lens as we move forward. And so we're excited to have him on board to help us provide more content and more knowledge because good Lord, Scott and I know we need more.
We need to be more cultured.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
I'll bring the culture.
Yeah, you can bring the culture since you're like 1/5 Japanese. That's the culture we need.
Well, he's also from California too, so there's that.
Well, and his pops is in Texas, so he gets to do all the things.
I forgot about that.
I'm like Cali country meets Japan.
There needs to be a movie.
I'm like a melting pot.
That's why. Yep, that's the culture we're looking for.
Exactly. Oh man. Well,
I'll bring the diversity to the crew here, guys.
Hey, you know what? I was talking to HR, aka myself, and I was thinking that we needed a little more diversity in our workplace.
I'm here for it.
Since we're a small business.
Yeah.
Support small businesses, everybody. Go buy one of our barrel picks. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Bourbon Lens. We really appreciate you all joining this episode, and I hope you learned something more about Japanese whiskey. Please rate us, give us a 5-star review on your favorite podcast listening app. It would be greatly appreciated, and Scott would give you a high five if he sees you in person if you do it. Last but not least, go check out our social medias at Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok at Bourbon Lens, and exclusive access to content on patreon.com/Bourbon Lens, exclusive tastings, exclusive access to barrel picks, and all other things Bourbon Lens related. And until next time, cheers.
Kanpai.
Cheers.